I'd like to share two reflections with you. We're coming up to Holy Week, and I don't think you have to be Christian. I don't think you have to be a practicing Christian. It doesn't really matter from where I'm sitting. Religion gives you a symbolic life, It's a way of living symbolically. And it's not sort of necessary to belong to it as an institution. I mean, that's my feeling. And that's not negating the institution. That's not being negative about the institution. It's just like, you're there, you're living your life. You may be disengaged with the institutional side of religion, and you might be thinking that leaves you outside. But it doesn't really. At least it doesn't leave me outside. I'm more involved with the kind of riches of living symbolically now than I ever was in my life. So when you come to the time of year coming up, Holy Week, I think it's a beautiful, beautiful time. It's spring, it's renewal, it's just opening yourself to new possibilities. And all that is good and it's possible. And I wish you well with it next week. Have a really good week. And if you're going through a kind of a space of meditation and paying attention to all the wonderful, beautiful aspects of reality that are around you, that enfold you, that care for you, enjoy them. And think about the way that our lives tend to be observation. We all tend to be writers. We all tend to be storytellers because we're all, I suppose, observing. And what you can do during a sort of religious period like Holy Week is you observe things, but you're holding on to a symbolic meaning of things as well. And I have two memories to share with you. One is from 13 or 14 years ago, and the other is from about 10 years ago. I'll share these two memories with you, and then I'll talk about them, because what I'm interested in, what I'd like to share with you about them, is the sense of the observer. This is a writer observing and just telling a story. And it's something that I can do, and I can write it in a newspaper or in a book, or I can share it with you. But it's also something that you can do in your ordinary life, and it actually becomes your prayer life. And that's where it started for me. So, in other words, things are happening around you. And at this time of year, spring is happening. If you're living in a rural area, if you're living by the sea, you'll notice changes in nature. If you're living in an urban area, you'll still notice beautiful and wonderful changes in nature when you go into a park or when you look outside your window. If you're living in a northern area like Ireland, well, you notice the massive change in light, and the clock that went back, that went forward last week, has given us now, light until 7:30 in the evening. So when you look around, you're observing stuff, and then when you're living symbolically, you're kind of making a link between what's happening around you and some sense symbols that come out of religious tradition. You begin to use the symbol from the religion as a sort of a lens through which to understand the reality around you. So I was in hospital 2 years ago. I was in Beaumont at this time of year, and I came out about, I think it was the 1st of April, which on that year was also Good Friday. But I remember that when I was living in the hospital and waiting for an operation and being a little bit terrified about operations, I would hold on to images of Good Friday, of the crucifixion. And in some sense, I was kind of using it as a life raft. You know, I'd be thinking, well, this is my experience of the operation is in some symbolic way I'm living through Good Friday with the hope that I will arrive at Easter Sunday. And that's what I mean by living symbolically. So there's two parts to this. One is the way that you observe other people, you observe the world around you. You observe the beautiful way that nature and other people enfold you with tenderness, and you become aware of it. And that observational disposition is very much the storyteller or the writer, because as you become aware of what happens around you, you have actually gathered the story of it. You know, by becoming conscious of what's happening around you, you're also lodging it in your memory, that you can access it later if you were, like me, a writer with a typewriter, so you'd be accessing it later with a typewriter or a laptop. I call it a typewriter, but it's a laptop. And that's as simple as it is. That to me is the be-all and end-all of writing, where you're observing, you're listening, you're watching, and you're aware that you're watching. You're conscious that you're watching. And so you're able to shape what's happening in front of you as a story. It's a kind of a really, I have to say, it's a good way to live, you know. I have found it over years, just as a therapy, just as a way of living. It's an intersection between some kind of mindfulness practice and the practice of observation, because you're a storyteller. So for years and years I would have been mindful of what's happening around me, and it wasn't because I was into mindfulness, it was simply because I was a storyteller. And I knew that this is the craft I have to learn. If you go back to the 1970s, and I was at that time trying to be a writer, well, I would be mindful to a small extent, and I would be able to write down to a small degree the things that were happening around me. But when I would read somebody else, I would be amazed at how superb their writing was, and I could see that the reason it was graphic and intensely real was because they had observed so much. They'd seen so much, and they'd been conscious of it, so they were able to write it down later. And I remember there was a great masterful writer called Aidan Higgins, and he wrote a masterful book called Language Go Down, a wonderful book. He wrote many other books as well, by the way. But on one occasion when he was a young writer, he sent one of his scripts, I think it was the original manuscript of Language Go Down, and he sent it off to Samuel Beckett with the wise attitude that if he needed advice from somebody he didn't know, and if he was going to reach out to somebody, well, why not reach out to the best? And he was amazed when, sometime later, Samuel Beckett returned the manuscript with about 17 pages of notes. And it was a great help to the young writer. But the consistency within Samuel Beckett's notes had to do with observation. He would constantly be making notes, urging the writer to be more specific. So when the writer would say the trees were full of leaf, the remark would be, well, what kind of tree was it? And that's the detail that you get when you begin observing the world, you know. The man was wearing a hat, but what kind of a hat? He put the wallet in his pocket. He was wearing a suit. What kind of a suit? What colour was it? Is there any other description or descriptive word you could use? The kind of clarity that is in words comes from observation, and observation comes from mindfulness. So there you have it. The writer is simply observing the world that's going on around her or him. You're observing the world, and you're mindful of the world. And that's where there's an intersection between creative writing and mindfulness. And it's also where creative writing can become a form of prayer, as it has become for me, a form of prayer. Because when I'm actually in some situation which is disturbing, and I give you the example of being in hospital in Beaumont at this time of year, when I'm in, if you like, enemy territory in that sense, so what I'm observing is details that are frightening me, like the doctors and surgeons coming with their masks and injections, and I'm lying on a slab and I'm going to, go unconscious and have a huge operation or something. When I'm in those situations, I live symbolically. So I take, let's say, the crucifixion, because it happened to be in that week when I was having an operation. And so, well, it was the week before, but that's only a detail. Basically, it was what I held on to as a life raft. So I'm going through an experience that is in itself disturbing, that in a way as an experience that could disintegrate me. It could leave me so stressed that my consciousness would become fragmented into just a blur of anxieties. And how do I hold on in those stormy seas of disturbing life experience? I try to live symbolically. I take, we'll say, Jesus in the garden, Jesus dreading Good Friday, Jesus being crucified or tortured. I take those experiences as sort of realities that are symbolically happening in my body, in my time. The ancient old monks would have said that you were uniting yourself with Christ. Now, Buddhist practice is more consciously mindful and tries to allow you to experience a detachment from what's going on. You're kind of practicing an understanding that the deeper reality is not just this surface of torment or suffering. And so, I suppose you could imagine that if I was strong enough to be Buddhist about it all, I wouldn't need to hold on to symbols. If I could go through, let's say, an operation with complete equanimity and detachment, that, everything is an illusion, then I'd be fine. And that's the kind of equanimity that you will find when you read, the lives of Tibetan monks who have been suffering over the years in prisons, let's say in China in the 50s and 60s and 70s. You find amazing stories of equanimity, where the practitioner is able to stand back from the experience and not just acknowledge that it is a temporary experience, not just acknowledge that it is an illusion, that it doesn't have a reality of its own at all, but in fact, practitioners who are able to understand that if somebody is perpetrating some aggression on them, some suffering upon them coming from another person, they're able to kind of extend compassion to that other person. So that's really strong mindfulness, isn't it? And I can tell you, I wouldn't be anywhere near that sort of strength. So maybe Christianity is for the weaker people, in a sense. Because what I get from my Christianity is that in a troubling situation where I cannot detach myself from what's happening to me, at least I can live through the terror with a life raft, with a sense that I'm connecting with the story of Jesus as I live through this moment. Like the storm in the boat. You know, the storm, and they're all in the boat and Jesus is asleep and they're all terrified of the storm. By the way, you're talking about lakes. I mean, there's a lake there near Capernaum. I forget the name of it, but, you know, it's very much... And also, they went out to sea from Capernaum. They were all fishermen. So you can imagine a real serious sea storm, or a storm on a gigantic lake. And there's terror in the boat, and Jesus is asleep, and then they wake him up and he calms the storm. Now, I'm not taking that story as literally true, and I'm not sort of questioning the literal truth of the Gospels. I'm simply saying that the deeper truth for me in any of the stories in the Gospel is their symbolic meaning. And I think that maybe they were written symbolically, because if they had been written as literal truth, if the Gospels contained the literal, factual story of Jesus, it would become dated very quickly. But because the richness in the Gospels is its symbolic power, it sustains itself as meaningful 2,000 years later. And so I can take a story in the Gospel, like when there was a storm and they were all afraid in the boat, and I can connect it with maybe a journey I'm making when I'm in ill health, when I'm looking into a week or two in hospital. Or if I'm really terrified of an operation that's coming my way, or of some bad news, or some struggle with some disease or illness, I can take something like the stories of Holy Week, the stories of the crucifixion of Jesus, the torture, the arrest, the dreadedness the night before it all happened, the last bread and wine meal he had with his friends. You know, I can take any of those things and live it symbolically. I can feel that my flesh, my blood, my life is in some way assumed into the reality of the symbol. I start with my literal life, the story of my own life as I live it from day to day. I acquire the symbols that come to me from the Gospels, and eventually, as I meditate on them, the symbol becomes the reality into which I am being assumed. I begin by saying, You know, the story of the gospel, the story of Jesus belongs to me. And by the end of the meditation, I'm thinking, I belong to Jesus. Now, people outside Christian faith will feel that phrase is very cheesy. It's very old-fashioned. It's like, have we not moved on? Well, in a way, I don't think we have. The symbol seems to be outside time. It seems to be eternal. And again, when you cross into living symbolically, you're moving over that threshold that comes during mindfulness. And it's the threshold that brings you into prayer. It brings you beyond you being the center of the conscious, mindful being. So being here now is what you do in mindfulness. You are here, you are present, and you're observing the world going on around you. But when you go over a threshold, and there is a threshold inside in that stillness of your consciousness, there's a threshold where if you go beyond it, it's no longer you who lives, but in some sense, a bigger, wider consciousness inhabits you so much that you then inhabit the consciousness. You belong in a wider sense of consciousness. And you feel, you recognize it when you look at the mountain or you look at the lake or you look into the eyes of somebody else. You feel that in some sense it's the one consciousness that is all about us. And this podcast as a preparation, I suppose, for Holy Week, I'm saying to you that this can work in a very practical way. And it goes from just being an observer of the world around you, and that becoming a mindfulness which intersects with the storyteller. But eventually, if you go through experiences which are troubling, and those experiences could be going into hospital. I keep talking about that one because it happened to me 2 years ago and this is the anniversary of it. But if you have other experiences which are troubling, it could be simply because you're alone. It could be simply a sense of anxiety about being alone. One of the most common killers, they say, is loneliness. So there must be a huge amount of us, and I'd include myself, that despite having family, despite having loving partners, despite having wonderful children, there's yet times where we feel so alone that it almost derails us, it almost disturbs us. And that's the kind of trouble that nobody can see. I mean, people can see you have trouble if you're going into hospital, you have trouble if you have pain, if you have constant pain, you have trouble if maybe there's upsets in your family and dysfunction arises in your family. So there's loads of ways that there is trouble, stressfulness, that everybody else can see and have sympathy for you. But nobody sees you when you're alone. And that can be a very, very difficult place to be for some people. Now, what I'm saying this week is that in those moments, what I have done in the past is I have then used the Christian narratives, the Christian stories, the stories that come out of the gospel, and I've used them as life rafts. I've used them as like an anchor. It's not that I'm saying there's anything literally true in the gospel, not that I'm saying there's anything literally untrue, but I'm saying that I use them because they are symbols. I use their symbolic force. Jesus is asleep in the boat, and all the people in the boat are terrified. I'm one of the people in the boat. I am terrified. I am afraid of the storm. The storm is the coming operation, let's say. And I'm afraid of all this. And then I wake up Jesus, and Jesus says, don't be afraid. I'm always with you. And I'm not reading it as history. I'm reading it in its symbolic form and with its symbolic power. I am with Jesus in the boat. I am in this storm of life in relation to my health. And Jesus is saying to me, be not afraid. And that's how the symbol works. That's how living symbolically, which is the jewel in all religion, is to live this symbolic life. It's nothing to do with historical reality. It's nothing to do with science. It's nothing to do with... It doesn't go against any of the sciences or the social sciences, psychology or psychotherapy. It's just a symbolic way of living. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a psychotherapist. I know nothing about the sciences. But all I do know about is storytelling. That's the one thing I do know about. And I notice over 30, 40 years that there's an intersection between being a storyteller, where you're observing the world around you, and prayerfulness. Because you develop detachment when you're watching the world around you, when you're observing people behave, and when you're trying to observe the detail, like not just look at the tree, but what kind of a tree. Is it an oak tree or a beech tree that you're looking at? And that kind of clarity, which is necessary to be a writer or a storyteller, also leaves you with this disposition of observing the world around you. I could do that all the time as a storyteller without having faith in any religious sense. But it's when life gets tough and I become terrorized and frightened by emotional traumas or by physical and health traumas. And that's when I begin to see that in that moment I could actually use the symbols of the Christian tradition to live symbolically, to hitch my whole conscious distress to the story in the gospel, let's say of the crucifixion, let's say of the scourging at the pillar, whatever. I bind myself to it in every sinew of my physical body and every ounce of conscious energy in my mind. I bind myself, like St. Patrick does in that beautiful prayer that we talked about last week. I bind myself to this. And I do it because if I can wrap my entire consciousness around a symbol, the symbol draws me in, it sucks me in, and I begin to live symbolically. And I'm transformed as well, which is the resurrection. I am transformed because I'm journeying now. It's not me that journeys, but I belong to this great symbolic transformation from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And I wanted to share that with you because it's Easter coming. And rather than do things after Easter, I suppose I wanted to do them even before Holy Week begins. And there's two There's two little stories and I'll finish with one of them. As I say, it's an observation from, nearly 13 years ago. I saw a mink last week on my way to the train. Black and shiny, its gorgeous coat far superior to even the most beautiful black cat I ever had. It was running across the road that leads down to Loch Ennel, where the swans live. There was something about its wild nature that I envied. And later in the day, I met Natalie, a Russian friend, on Grafton Street, and she was wearing a big black fur coat. So I began thinking of her too as wild. I rubbed the fur on her shoulders and asked her, was it real? She said, of course it is real. I said, have you ever been to the fur shop down the street? Yes, she said, I love that shop, but I do not go there any more because of recession. What kind of animal are you wearing today? I wondered. Rabbit, she said, apologetically, as if perhaps she might be more comfortable in the skin of a white tiger or a Siberian wolf. Well, that's not too offensive, I said. In fact, Irish people actually eat rabbits. Oh, she said, you must come to my house tonight and I will cook you rabbit. I declined the offer, explaining that I had a prior engagement. That night I was scheduled to partake in a panel discussion on the radio with two other people, a young man and a woman, both of whom are known as entertainment journalists. We were going to talk about movies. When the program began, I tried to sound as if I knew something about Hollywood. Apparently Sandra Bullock is having personal problems, I declared, but everybody already knew that. The young man beside me explained how the movie under review was not very good and was the same as half a dozen other movies, and how the storyline was silly, but that Sandra looked good. If you like Sandra, he said, you will like this movie. He sounded like he knew her intimately. The presenter was just off a plane from New York, and he was sporting an impressive tan. And the young woman on the panel was all giggles like Marilyn Monroe, on the verge of ecstasy, as if this was the happiest day of her life. I just didn't know enough about movies, and I couldn't keep up with the eloquence of the other two. I was amazed at how much they knew about celebrities and at all the hot gossip they had about Hollywood. At one stage I asked them, was there a danger that we might be losing the run of ourselves, and that perhaps our overfamiliarity with American culture was a sign that we were as a nation still colonized? They looked at me as if I had two heads. I left the studio a bit dazed and wandered into a nearby pub. A young woman in Gothic evening wear was leaning against the bar and holding her head like she had a migraine. I asked her, was anything wrong? She said she was in the back of a taxi and she heard an old geezer on the radio trying to say something intelligent about movies. The old fart probably wasn't at a movie for decades, she said. He was going on about being colonized or something. He said he was from Mullingar, wherever that is, probably on planet Zog. No, I said, Mullingar is in Westmeath. It's an hour away on a train. How do you know? She asked. I said, the fart on the radio was me. Jesus, she exclaimed. That's cool. We didn't have much of a vocabulary in common, so I tried to use words judiciously. When she asked me, would I like to join her for a drink, I said, that'd be cool. And she said I was cool. And then the drinks arrived, my wine and her vodka, which is when she realised that she left her money in the taxi, and she was all distressed about that. So I paid, and she thanked me, and I said, don't worry, it's cool. And then, for the sake of conversation, I said that I had seen a sleek black mink that morning on the road to Loch Ennel, where the swans live, and that it was utterly wild and beautiful. She stared at me with some unease and said, you're really off the wall, man. Yeah, I wrote that on the 2nd of April in 2010, and there's nothing can follow it except be well, and if you want to be a writer, watch people, listen to people, don't put any psychology into it, just be a witness to what happens. And if you're troubled in your mindfulness, find that threshold and reach over it and begin to live symbolically. Use Christ or the prophet, may his name be blessed. Use the Buddha or any of the Buddha narratives. Use whatever faith is suitable to you, Hindu or Jewish, or maybe your own version of it. Maybe the gods that you talk to, the mentor deities that hang around your room, are ancestors, or parents, or people that you've lost from this life. But live with them symbolically, and know that they carry you, like a boat carries you through a storm, and that at the end there will be transformation into joy. Have a wonderful Holy Week from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday. And thank you for being here. Bye-bye.